Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Maggie Burns and I'm the Ecology Action Centre's Executive Director. I'd like to thank you all for tuning into this debate on environmental issues for the federal riding of Halifax in this place, which is also known as Chibuktuk. The Ecology Action Centre has organized this debate in coordination with 100 other grassroots and community groups across the country who are holding environmental debates today as part of the 100 Debates on the Environment Initiative. For tonight's debate, the candidates are gathered here in person with our team, and our audience is tuning in remotely. We would like to thank everyone who helped make this debate possible, including the Ummah Mosque and Community Center for hosting us, GreenPAC for spearheading the 100 debates across the country, and our staff and volunteers for taking care of the many logistics behind the scenes. After a summer of wildfires, brutal heat waves, and erratic rainfall, environmental concerns are top of mind for many of us as we head to the polls for this federal election. We're very glad for this opportunity to hear how each candidate attending this evening would approach vital issues like climate change, biodiversity protection, and environmental justice. Tonight, we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, which is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship. These treaties were signed in the 1700s, affirmed in Section 35 of Canada's Constitution in 1982. These treaties do not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but rather set out a framework for how the relationship between Mi'kmaq and settlers should unfold in peace and in friendship. In particular, when we talk about environmental issues, it's important to remember that Mi'kmaq have lived sustainably in this place for over 14,000 years, and that we cannot separate issues of land and water from issues of Indigenous sovereignty and rights. For me, as I speak a land acknowledgement like this one, I have a feeling of fierce hopefulness that despite centuries of injustice and ongoing injustice, we can do better. We must. Perhaps, like many of you, you'll hold on to that same feeling of fierce hopefulness as I watch tonight's debate. We can and we must do better. As a registered charity, EAC is committed to being nonpartisan. As such, we extended an invitation to all major parties running in the provincial election. Tonight, we're joined by Andy Fillmore, Liberal Party of Canada, Joanne Roberts, Green Party of Canada, Lisa Roberts, Canada's New Democratic Party. Cameron Ells from the Conservative Party of Canada is not here tonight due to a scheduling conflict. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Joan Baxter. Joan is an acclaimed author and journalist who has been a strong voice for environmental and social justice in Nova Scotia for many years. We're very pleased to have her join us to moderate this debate. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. My name is Joan Baxter, and I am a journalist and author from Nova Scotia. Grew up in Dartmouth. I now live in rural Nova Scotia. I spent a long time reporting from various countries in Africa for international media such as the BBC, but now I'm home in Nova Scotia. And yes, I am a thorn in the side of many politicians, so it's very nice to be here with some this evening. I contribute quite frequently to the Halifax Examiner. So I thank everyone for joining us tonight because this is a really, really important debate. Some of you are joining via Zoom, which you're probably quite used to by now. And some of you may be watching on the Ecology Action Centre YouTube channel live stream. So we hope wherever you are that you're comfortable and ready for some very interesting discussion tonight, because these are really important issues, not just for us, but for all the generations to come. We have a dedicated tech team here working behind the scenes. Fortunately, that I'm not on it. So please reach out through the Zoom chat if you have any problems at all, and they will help you. As you know, especially today, productive conversations have to be done with respect. And it's extremely important in a healthy democracy that people respect each other when they discuss things. So here are a few of the ground rules. I know that we have some well-behaved people here this evening, but just a reminder, we expect all candidates to engage in respectful dialogue about the issues, and please refrain from any personal attacks. There won't be any tolerance of anything that resembles hate speech or personal attacks towards candidates or other participants or anything of that sort. I can be tough. Our set of questions will begin with 8 open-ended ones and wrap up with 6 shorter yes or no questions. We love those, journalists. And we very seldom get yes or no answers. These will include a few questions that were submitted in advance by the Ecology Action Centre community, and also some that were drawn from the 100 debates on the Environment Initiative. So these will be asked in debates across the country. We have wonderful volunteer timekeepers sitting right here in front of me. They're the tough ones. Watch for them. There will be a timekeeper who signals when you have 15 seconds left to go. You'll get a warning yellow card. And then when you get a red stop sign, you have to be quiet. I'm not saying we'll cut off your mics, but we will tell you to be, thank you. We'll expect you to stop talking. I'll be pretty strict about this because I've been told I have to be. And with that in mind, I'd like to invite each of our candidates to make their opening statements. We did a draw so as to who would go first. And Joanne Roberts of the Green Party was the lucky candidate. So she will go first, and she'll have 1.5 minutes for her opening statements, followed by Lisa Robertson and Andy Fillmore. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joan, for having agreed to moderate this debate, and for the Ecology Action Centre for being willing to host it, and to the community here at the mosque for having us here. And I want to say thanks to Lisa and Andy for coming. It is nice to be in a race where you have colleagues as opposed to fierce opponents. Today is my 65th birthday. And I can tell you, there is no way I could have predicted that I would spend this day fighting to save our common home. But believe me, I believe all of us have a duty of care to protect young people from the climate crisis. So I am here, not popping champagne or eating cake. You will hear a lot of numbers this evening, but I want us to hold one number in our minds: 815. That is the number of Canadians who died suddenly in June because of the devastating heat dome in Canada. They paid the price for our lack of action on the climate crisis. We can honor those who died by taking action outlined by scientists from around the world in the latest IPCC report. I am running as a Green because the Green Party remains the only party that has a target and a plan that corresponds with the science. And we are here because we believe this should be a top priority. And anyone who is dedicated, qualified, and will work across party lines, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for watching us having this conversation. As the NDP candidate for Halifax, I want to join the team, the NDP caucus in Ottawa, which I hope will be made up of many of the amazing candidates across the country. A team that wants to fight the climate crisis as if we want to win. And that means something. Unfortunately, the sad reality is that since signing on to the Paris Agreement, Canada is the only G7 country where emissions have gone up, and we haven't met targets, many of those targets having been set by the Stephen Harper government. So we cannot afford years more of inadequate ambition given the scale of the climate crisis. The NDP's plan to fight the climate emergency and win is to cut emissions by more than half and meet the 1.5 degree target that scientists say is necessary to prevent catastrophe, and to do it by centering the people who haven't contributed the most to the climate crisis that we are in.
Okay, thank you to GreenPAC and EAC for this, and thanks to the Ummah Masjid for having us tonight. 2 years ago, I stood on a bridge in Herring Cove, and I was standing there with some constituents, and we watched the roof of a fish shack float by after Hurricane Dorian. It was that morning after we all woke up in the bright sunshine and to see the damage. The storm surge had compromised the breakwater at the mouth of Herring Cove Harbor, and it had lifted whole fishing shacks from their foundations, smashing them against the rocks along the shoreline. We watched as one family climbed up on another sort of half submerged fish house, trying to, as it floated by, trying to pull out of their last remaining belongings. Now, the science is clear. Climate change is escalating in the severity and the frequency of these severe weather events. And for a coastal community like ours, it's a flashing red alert. We are in a climate emergency. In our first mandate, Liberals enacted the strongest climate plan of any government in Canadian history, with over 50 measures, including pricing carbon pollution, phasing out coal, protecting nature, and investing in renewables. As for my own climate record, I passed a motion to put a climate lens on federally funded infrastructure. I kept my promise to clean up an environmental disaster in Harrietsfield. I led Canada's first ever national active transportation strategy. And when Halifax was seeking federal funding to purchase new diesel buses, I intervened and redirected the federal funding to electrify those buses. We've made progress, but we have further to go. We can't let the Conservatives form your vote in this election to continue moving Canada forward on climate.
Thank you, Joanne, Lisa, and Andy. Okay, we move on to the questions now. You will have, for the first 8 questions, you'll have 1.5 minutes each to respond. You can use your 1.5 minutes if you want to, as a combination of rebutting your colleagues or in promoting your own answer. You can choose how you use it. So fortunately, somebody did a wonderful spreadsheet for me so I could figure out these numbers. And the person who goes first on the first question is Andy Fillmore. And here's the question. During the COVID-19 emergency, our governments implemented mandatory measures with successful results. When it comes to the climate emergency, actions taken to date have been almost entirely voluntary. Are you prepared to switch from incentive-based and voluntary principles to mandatory measures to combat the climate crisis? And what would those mandatory measures be, if so?
Absolutely, yes. And our record shows that our flagship environmental policy made sure that polluting in Canada is no longer free and put a mandatory price on carbon pollution that increases annually. We fought tooth and nail to put carbon pricing in place across the country, including long legal battles with provinces, including Alberta and Ontario. Other mandatory measures include eliminating combustible engine run cars and light trucks by 2025, banning harmful single-use plastics, the green stream of ICIP, which requires projects to reduce GHGs by 45% in order to access that funding, tens and tens of billions of dollars worth of community infrastructure investment going through the climate lens, which was created by my private members motion. And here in Halifax, as I mentioned, I intervened in the purchase of diesel buses. And we're also implementing a clean fuel standard to significantly reduce pollution by making the fuels we use every day cleaner while we transition to renewables. I have shown, and the Liberal Party has shown, that we're not afraid to take a stand against these urgent issues because we have no other choice and time is running out.
Thank you very much. I got my numbers wrong. That was supposed to be Lisa. So we'll go to Lisa now.
Thank you. And yes, we need mandatory measures. But to be clear, it's not a question of either a carbon tax or mandatory measures. It's a yes and. So we support a carbon tax. It's an important tool and it's part of the NDP platform, including to eliminate loopholes which allow big polluters to escape paying their fair share of the carbon tax. But obviously that is not sufficient. And obviously, I think also it is counterproductive to our goal to both fight climate change with a carbon tax on one hand and to buy a pipeline or to give subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So in terms of the NDP mandatory measures, a very important piece is improving the building code so that by 2025, every new building built in Canada is net zero. The NDP is also committed to retrofitting all older building stock by 2050. At the current pace, it would take 142 years to retrofit all low-rise residential buildings. And the NDP would also put climate leadership at the center of government decision-making by creating a climate accountability office to give independent oversight so that we know that we're actually meeting our targets and where we are falling short.
Thank you, Lisa.
Obviously, good government combines mandatory and voluntary policies. The goal should be a reward for doing something we value as a country, and there should be penalties for what we don't want to see. So as a Green MP, I would advocate for continued funding for green initiatives. Andy, thanks for the buses, but wouldn't it have been better if you couldn't buy buses with a diesel engine? And that's why we're calling for the ban of all internal combustion engine passenger vehicles by 2030, and then moving on to commercial vehicles, because that is how you put the two together. So the money helps, and I appreciate that. We would also, like the NDP, change the building codes. That's where builders are looking for guidance. So it would be mandatory by 2030 that all new construction meet net zero standards. We would keep in place the ban that the Liberals brought in, because this is where we have to be. We have to work collaboratively. We shouldn't make the environment, in my opinion, a partisan issue. We should have a climate cabinet that sits down and agrees with what's right. The goal of Greens. We would ban the export of thermal coal from Canada. That will mean we'll stop mining it. We will cancel all pipeline projects and all subsidies to fossil fuels. And we will tell you how much we're going to increase the carbon tax, $25 per ton each year until 2030. That will make a difference. Mandatory rules that people will follow.
Thank you, everyone, for being so punctual.
We're working on it.
Okay, question 2, and I'm just going to reverse the order this time. So Andy, you will go first, Joanne second, and then Lisa third. That's okay. Is Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia is facing the worst sea level predictions in Canada and experiencing climate change impacts, including flooding, storm surge, inundation, and increased erosion at an accelerating rate. What is your plan to help jurisdictions next to the ocean, like those in Atlantic Canada, secure the resources we need to take adaptation action before it's too late?
Thanks. Well, smart infrastructure is one of our best defenses against climate change and preparing us for extreme weather and flooding that comes along with it. I've toured coastal communities devastated by hurricanes like Hurricane Dorian, and I've helped those communities rebuild wharves and breakwaters. The threat of climate change on a coastal city like Halifax cannot be understated. In my first year in office, I passed a private member's motion, M45, that requires GHG analyses of federal infrastructure because I saw the role that climate smart, climate resilient infrastructure plays in this crisis. This builds upon a lifelong career of being a city planner, designing cities and communities that are able to adapt. Our government initiated the development of Canada's first national adaptation strategy, which is ongoing, and established the $3.4 million Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. And this year, our platform includes measures to fund home retrofits to protect against extreme weather, to create low-cost national flood insurance programs, and to train 1,000 new community-based firefighters to ensure we're ready for future fire seasons. In my final moments, when I was at VP at Waterfront Development Corporation, we had a choice to face as we modernized Halifax's waterfront. Should we go to concrete and steel wharves, or should we stick with the wooden wharves? We chose to go with grown in Nova Scotia hemlock pressure-treated wharves that, when they get damaged by a storm, can be repaired the same day by a local craftsperson in a dinghy at low cost that very same day. This is climate resiliency in a coastal infrastructure environment that is working. Thanks.
In order to adapt, we need to know the risks so that we can ensure we invest in state-of-the-art assessment of climate change impact risks and planning that goes with this management of these measures. So that means in investing in research that'll be done right here in Halifax, because we have such a community that cares about this and is working hard at it. So grants by the Green Party would go from $22.4 billion to $30 billion in investing in climate change research adaptation. We would increase the funding for the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund to support climate resilient projects, rehabilitation of stormwater systems, and restoration of wetlands, shorelines, and other natural infrastructure. We would be stepping in so that we do not see an owl's head become a golf course. We would also invest in a global climate supercomputer, something the scientists are telling us they needed this summer. They could not predict much of what was happening because they didn't have the computing power. Wouldn't it be great if Canada took the lead on this? As well, we need more floodplain mapping, funding, and legislation to ensure that there is support to move people who are at risk out of these areas and provide protection from development going forward. We know what needs to be done. We need to invest in the people who will take us there.
I think there's a fair amount of agreement on this question. Supporting communities to invest in infrastructure so that they are able to withstand the worst impacts of climate change and extreme weather events is absolutely necessary. And the NDP is also committed to providing the federal funds for the other levels of government. When I was an MLA, I introduced legislation, sadly not picked up and passed, that was aimed at supporting municipalities to take local action on climate change. We know that, in fact, when there was support for municipalities to make plans for how they could adapt locally, that really spurred action. Unfortunately, with the Liberal government provincially, they period and people change. We need to figure out ways using federal dollars to ensure that those sorts of plans are constantly worked on, implemented, and improved. Because again, just as the weather events are becoming more extreme, our ambitions and our energy and our focus on doing that work and responding to that, responding to the situations has to also be constantly ramping up.
Question 3, the order of this one will be Joanne first in the hot seat, Lisa second, and Andy third. And this one is about Canada's commitment to protect at least 30% of its land, freshwater, and ocean by 2030. Do you support this target? What is your plan to halt and reverse nature loss and protect species at risk? And may I take the liberty of adding biodiversity to that question?
Okay. Thanks, Joan. Won't be a surprise to anyone that yes, Greens do support this. It is interesting to note where we sit in the world. We have 20% of the world's wild forests in this country. We have 24% of its wetlands and almost a third of the stored land carbon. We have a responsibility. So these numbers sound like, oh, you know, let's just take the 20 or 30% of that. No, those are important numbers, not just for us, but for our planet. Yes, we support protecting 30% of freshwater and lands in each Canadian ecosystem by 2030, but we take that further, 50% by 2050, with a priority on carbon-rich ecosystems. Greens would support Indigenous-led protected conservation areas and fund stewardship of these lands and water to be led by Indigenous guardians. The Guardians program exists, we need to expand it. We would implement Canada's international commitments because we've made the commitments to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the follow-up protocols. We just haven't done it yet. We would initiate a national urban biodiversity regeneration strategy to expand our green space. Didn't we discover how much we want that during COVID? That would protect urban sensitive species like birds. So you can count on Greens to make sure that we do protect what we love on this planet.
Also, we are committed to protecting at least 30% of land, freshwater, and ocean by 2030, including through expanding urban national parks with an amazing one, you know, in the works here in Halifax, restoring urban biodiversity, and ensuring that the Species at Risk Act is enforced. We would, within the NDP, launch a 10-year nature plan to reverse species lost and curb the import and domestic trade of wild animals. And we would protect our oceans and our fresh water by reducing emissions from shipping, an area where carbon calculations is often a little bit fuzzy and incomplete. So both from shipping and fishing, expand marine protected areas and reduce key threats to ocean ecosystems, and also implement a national freshwater strategy. I'm also really excited about the NDP plan to create a civilian climate corps that would mobilize young people and create new jobs, including by restoring areas of our coastal environment like salt marshes, where good work can both mitigate and help with adaptation.
Well, yes, absolutely. In fact, it's our government's goal to protect at least 25% of lands and freshwater and oceans by 2025, and then 30% by 2030. In fact, we've made and will continue to make the largest ever investment in nature protection in Canada, in Canadian history, to advance this goal. And our record shows this. Now, when we came into office in 2015, we had inherited a reality where only 1% of Canada's oceans were protected. Now, in the 6 years since then, we've moved it to 14%. We've also protected land mass equal to 3.5 times the size of Nova Scotia, and we're going to keep on going. I want to shift it to urban areas. Now, when I was a city planner here in Halifax, I spent a career trying to stop suburban sprawl and create dense cities that prevent deforestation, that move communities to where infrastructure already exists. And I know how important the land piece is when we're building communities. I want to just tell you, before the adoption of our HRM by Design downtown plan, our urban core in Halifax was attracting only 17% of our residential growth. Shortly after its adoption, when it got rolling, the urban core is now attracting over 50% of urban growth, of residential growth. Every unit that you see getting built on the peninsula is one that's not getting built in a forest or a farm or a stream outside on the periphery. We have a plan going forward, which includes 10 new national parks, 10 national marine conservations, 15 new national urban parks, including the one that I've been working with EAC on for the last several years. Can't wait to get it going.
Thanks again for being so prompt so I don't have to come down on you. Okay, for the next question, the order will be Lisa up first, and then Andy number 2 and Joanne number 3. And this one is about the disproportionate effect that climate change has on racialized communities, people with disabilities, rural communities, women, and people living with low incomes. How do you propose to tackle climate action and these inequalities at the same time, ensuring that no one is left behind by the transition to a just and fair net zero economy?
I often think of Catherine Hayhoe's remarks at an ADSM for Women and Children event a couple of years ago, where she described climate change as a threat. I have a hard time saying the word threat multiplier. So where people are already at risk, climate change exacerbates that risk. And so we need to actually focus people who have been marginalized by our systems, including systems of colonialism and racism, at the very core of our response. The New Democrats will ensure that climate investments are directed towards reducing inequality, honoring Indigenous rights, and supporting communities that have been left behind for decades of liberal and conservative inaction. In particular, on a very practical level, retrofitting older multi-unit residential buildings means reducing greenhouse gas emissions, lowering bills, and providing greater comfort for every tenant. And we know that tenants have, on average, lower incomes and less wealth than homeowners. So I'm very excited about the focus on deep energy retrofits of existing multi-unit residential buildings with ties to tenant protection, or as part of a plan to purchase older buildings for the non-market sector of housing. Thank you.
Me?
Yes.
All right. Well, supporting a just transition is something that the Liberal team believes very strongly in, and it's something that I believe sets the Liberal plan apart from the other parties who really don't have a clear plan as yet for our workers. We're going to move forward with the just transition legislation that we've discussed previously, guided by workers, unions, Indigenous peoples, and communities, and will create more opportunities in the green economy for women, LGBTQ and BIPOC people, and other underrepresented groups. Now, some of the key areas for the just transition are the retrofit economy that will cut pollution and create jobs through home energy retrofits and converting existing buildings to housing, zero emissions vehicle manufacturing, and jobs in renewable energy, such as the Atlantic Loop that's been recently approved. On a personal note, I strongly believe that one way that every single Canadian can equitably participate in our journey toward net zero is through adopting an active transportation lifestyle. During the public engagement that I led for Canada's National Active Transportation Strategy, I spoke to a Black Nova Scotian cyclist from Beachville, and he told the story that in his community, not $1 had ever been spent on active transportation in Beachville, and that's just not good enough. Everyone must be able to participate equitably in our transition to a low carbon future, and I am absolutely committed to making sure that everybody can find a way to do that.
Don't relax. You're first.
But I get to go.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. We have seen, and I think this pandemic made it very clear to us. I asked you to think about the 815 people who died in the heat dome. You won't be surprised to find out who they are. They are the elderly. They are the poor. They are those who are not adequately housed. Climate change affects these groups very differently. But while we fight the climate, we also have to look to how to change their system. They're not left behind. One of the things that's in our platform that I'm very proud of, and I love that green ideas get taken up by other parties, especially when they're as good as this one, is our guaranteed livable income. The time has come. In fact, we had this wonderful experiment called CERB. We know we can do it in this country. Being poor is not a lack of character. It is a lack of cash. And when people have necessary funds for food and housing, they can make good choices. They often make the choices we want them to make for the environment. They choose to eat local food. They choose to cut back on what they're doing with their transportation. So the first thing I would say is we need to look at having a guaranteed livable income in this country. And we need to educate our population even more, which means eliminating post-secondary tuition.
Okay, thanks. Move on to question 5. The order for this one will be Andy, Joanne, and Lisa, if I've got that right.
It's in the spreadsheet.
It's in your spreadsheet, so we can blame him if it's wrong. Indigenous peoples protect over 80% of the world's biodiversity and have an internationally recognized right to a say over what happens on their land and waters. In the face of centuries of clear justice to Indigenous people, we must chart a path forward that makes right those injustices and fundamentally breaks with colonial practices. If elected, how would you and your party ensure that your actions respect and honor Indigenous title and rights?
Well, first, we remain steadfast in our commitment to advancing the important work of reconciliation with our Indigenous partners. And as we conserve more land, more inland waters, more marine and coastal areas, Indigenous-led conservation efforts are going to play a central role. We committed $340 million in new funding specifically to support Indigenous leadership in nature conservation. This includes the expansion of the Indigenous Guardians program that Joanne mentioned, and funding for additional Indigenous protected areas. Ultimately, though, this is about partnership, and we're going to continue to work with Indigenous communities on their environmental priorities that they make for themselves. Now, a bit of history. I think most of us know that in 2006, when the NDP and the Conservative Party combined to bring down the Paul Martin government, we lost $10 a day. We lost nationalized daycare, but we also lost the Kelowna Accord, which would have started reconciliation in Canada 9 years before, when our government actually got it started in 2015. history has a bad way of repeating itself. It's a very possible outcome here that if we allow the Conservatives to form government, we will lose our $10 a day daycare again, but we will also put our great national effort at reconciliation into the dustbin. And I implore voters in Halifax to not let that happen again.
Thanks.
I would agree with you on the Kelowna Accord being lost. I feel that that was one of the great steps forward, and it's taken us a long time to get close to it. But I have to say that as Greens, we would stop fighting Canada's Human Rights Tribunal, which is to compensate child and family victims of Canada's discrimination and ensure all non-status First Nations children living off reserve have access to Jordan's principle. We need to stop talking about this simply as a partnership. It is nation to nation. And once we start putting that lens on this, we will move forward. So we need to formally repudiate the doctrine of discovery. We need to be guided by Indigenous leadership to establish a transition out from under the Indian Act. We need to implement the 1996 report on the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, implement 94 of the calls to action from Truth and Reconciliation, implement all the calls for justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. We know what needs to be done here, and we need to start giving national recognition to Indigenous people. So we need to implement the land claims agreements that are already negotiated and are languishing for lack of funds, particularly for First Nations in the territories. Nation to nation, we will move forward.
Thank you. Thank you. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been passed into law. As a next step, New Democrats will build reconciliation into the heart of our plan to address the climate crisis, which is only fitting given that the impacts of climate change have already impacted Indigenous people disproportionately, particularly thinking of those in the North. So our plan to move forward ensures that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are full and equal partners in Canada's effort to confront the climate crisis. Indigenous people are best placed to protect cultural and biological diversity through control over their territory. We're committed to working with Indigenous governments, respecting Indigenous knowledge, and upholding Indigenous rights to protect lands, waterways, and biodiversity. This means making First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples full and equal partners in Canada's efforts to build a low carbon future, including encouraging energy sustainability in remote communities and ensuring equity opportunities for renewable energy projects. We also support the creation and expansion of Indigenous protected and conserved areas as a core piece of land and land protection, which is an important part of the climate response.
Thank you. Your timing is perfect. Okay, the question 6, we will go for Joanne first, Lisa, and then followed by Andy. For this debate, we invited questions from the EAC community, and we'll start with a question from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Laurette Geldenhuis, on behalf of the Nova Scotia Regional Committee of the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment. As physicians, we are particularly concerned about the serious health impacts of climate change. We want to know what concrete plans each federal party has to safeguard the people of Nova Scotia and Canada against the health impacts of climate change.
Well, I want to thank Laurette for her question. It is important that climate and climate change be considered part of our healthcare system. So we would start by reorienting Health Canada's mandate and make it more towards mental health, addictions, health promotion, disease prevention, and the risks of climate change. It has to be in the mandate. We would encourage medical associations, especially our medical school here at Dalhousie, to train healthcare professionals to understand and engage with climate change related health threats. Very little of their education now takes that into account, but if you talk to any physician, they'll tell you, if nothing else, about the increase they're seeing in asthma, especially if you happen to have forest fires that are making the air unbreathable. We also need to reduce our ecological and health risks. And I've got a list a mile long, and I'm not going to get through it all. So I will put it this way. We start setting targets for reducing the use of pesticides in agriculture. We strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and we legislate the right of Canadians to a healthy environment. We saw what that did when we put our rights in our charter. And it is important, if we are going to make our health an important part of our society and important to our government, that it be part of what we hold true. And so that means making a healthy environment a right. There's so much more to say.
So, I mean, I think that is exactly why climate change is an existential threat. It threatens our lives, and we're seeing it in ways that, you know, are almost unfathomable and deeply distressing. And as a mom of young kids, you know, when I go to the movies with them, or even watch stuff on Netflix, like most of the offerings are just absolutely like versions of the apocalypse, made slightly less scary, and people fighting the apocalypse, because we have not shown adequate leadership for so long. So, you know, protecting the environment is good for our health. And we have also failed to show leadership for so long that we now have to mitigate the impacts on our health of the climate change that has already happened. So again, I do come back to the building code, because, you know, who is going to suffer in heat waves? Folks in older buildings with, you know, poor heating and cooling systems, who aren't able to escape to, you know, a second home by the coast, folks who are vulnerable all the time. And so for me, addressing directly inequality is the path to also addressing the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
So the question is about healthy people and healthy communities. And of course, as a city planner, the social determinants of health are a foundational consideration in the building of livable, healthy, sustainable communities. When I was leading the review of Halifax's regional plan in 2011, I recruited our medical officer of health, Dr. Gaynor Watson-Creed, to sit on our advisory committee. And I'm glad to say that she's kept her association with the city going ever since, including helping the city to find a landing place for the active transportation funding that I've brought to the city for the All Ages and Abilities Bike Network. So I want to stay with active transportation on this. So let me say that over the last year, I have been leading the creation of this national active transportation strategy that I mentioned to you. I also pitched and won the first ever fund to support that, a $400 million active transportation infrastructure fund. So now we have a strategy and we have a fund to make it real. They are an important part of healthy communities because, as we know, AT is good for the environment. It reduces emissions. It's good for equity, as it allows people to get around the community no matter what their income or ability is. It's good for your health because it encourages active lifestyles. It helps us to live longer, happier, more productive lives. And it gives every single Canadian a chance to participate in the transition, as I said. In this election, our healthcare plan for the healthcare system is also very strong, with a funded plan to hire 7,500 more doctors and nurses, and to make an generational increase of $6 billion to the healthcare transfers.
Thank you. We are whipping through our questions.
Yeah.
Great, right? Question 7, and the answering order will be Lisa, Andy, and Joanne. Communities across the country, and this is a really urgent one, have failed to meet the demand for affordable housing. There's an understatement. The impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events, heat waves, and flooding, will disproportionately affect residents experiencing homelessness and insecure housing. What will you do to address the housing crisis and ensure Canadians can access housing and meet their basic needs?
Thank you. I was the NDP provincial housing critic for much of the past 5 years when I was the MLA for Halifax Needham. And so I have worked very closely with, been in frequent communication with the people trying to add to the stock of non-market housing in Halifax, and really just banging their heads against a wall against funding programs that are designed to work for the private sector. Somebody in the private sector, not often a somebody, but often a real estate investment trust or very large company, can find funds that will allow it to provide below market rent for 15 or 20 years, qualify for government funding, with the expectation that because a building lasts a whole lot longer than 15 or 20 years, the rent will go up afterwards, and it just reduces their financing costs. Folks in the nonprofit sector cannot make those sorts of calculations because they are in providing housing for a mission. We have not seen expansion of the non-market housing stock in Halifax. The Liberals under Paul Martin basically decimated that long-standing program in 1993. We need to get ambitious, and the NDP government would, with 500,000 units of quality affordable housing in the next 10 years, with half of that done within 5.
Thank you. I'm taking my cues from the boss here. Okay. So in my city planning career, I've seen firsthand how vital the provision of or access to how critical it is to have access to affordable housing. And as Halifax's population grows and continues to squeeze that vacancy rate, access to housing is an absolute top priority. Now, here in Halifax, I have a very good record of getting affordable housing built, including this year, 191 new affordable units are on their way. That includes projects with the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, ADSM for Women, and the North End Community Health Association that are actually under construction as we speak. Prior to the pandemic, I secured substantial funding for Mulgrave Park to replace many of their iconic retaining walls and to renew heating systems in those homes. And building on our national housing strategy, we have a plan to build or repair 1.4 million homes in the next 4 years. And we have to draw contrasts here. I want to contrast that to the NDP plan, which proposes 500,000 new builds over 10 years with no apparent plan to pay for it, other than asking provinces and municipalities to pay for it. And there doesn't appear to be a plan for repairs or for supportive housing whatsoever. We're also going to take measures to improve homeownership by banning blind bidding, by introducing a buyer's bill of rights, by creating a new tax-free first home savings account. And I guess I'm going to leave it there. Yep. Thanks.
A topic we could go on. I'm going to try and talk about the areas that my colleagues have not mentioned. I do believe our guaranteed livable income is part of looking at how do we address housing. But I want to talk about Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for a minute. It was created after the Second World War to create housing for veterans that were coming home and didn't have a place to live. Suddenly, in the 2021, we're looking at a corporation, a crown corporation, that has a priority of supporting Canadian lenders to de-risk investment. Instead, I think it is time we took CMHC back to its roots, and that is to support affordable, non-market, cooperative housing, and to look at housing markets individually across the country, which CMHC can do. So we need to take some of our government institutions that have good roots and already have an infrastructure and repurpose them. We also need to put in place something I think that is innovative by the Greens, a residential tenant support benefit, which would provide retroactive residential arrears assistance. So if you haven't been able to pay your rent and you need assistance so you're not evicted, this is an immediate solution. CMHC is a longer term solution. Yes, we would invest in building new homes like both of my colleagues, and our numbers are slightly different, but those are down the road. So we need to do two things now.
Thanks, everybody. It sounds like there's some solutions out there. Okay, now we come to the last question in the longer question session where you have longer to answer. And the order this time will be Andy, Joanne, and Lisa. So, and this one also comes from the EAC community from Margot Reeb-Butt on behalf of Nourish Nova Scotia. Food security is a significant challenge to families in Nova Scotia and is strongly linked to poverty. A universal school food program would support the health, well-being, and education of all children and level the playing field with respect to dignity and equity. If elected, what would you and your party do to advance a universal school food program for Canada, ensuring all children have access to healthy meals at school every day?
Thanks. Well, our platform does include a national school food policy and a national nutritious meal program with a $1 billion investment. We're also going to introduce new restrictions on the commercial marketing and food and beverages to children to establish new front of package labeling to promote healthy food choices. And the data me is very happy about that. Here in Halifax, I've worked with Hope Blooms to secure funding to build their new community building in the park there, where teaching and learning about food security is their core purpose. I also secured funding for their new global kitchen for social change, which is a 3,000 square foot commercial community kitchen that's going to complement their existing Hope Blooms gardens and turning the garden into the magic that they do there. The new kitchen is going to give them the resources and space that they'll need to expand their agri-food and social enterprise to serve not just our community, but communities beyond Halifax. These are the community-led initiatives that we need to continue to support while also supporting our local food producers. Got a couple of seconds left here. I also want to note that we're all seeing the proliferation of community gardens around the city. 10 years ago, it was almost impossible to get a community garden on a piece of city-owned land or public land. It's become commonplace now, and that is community members using their voices with local government to get the outcomes that they need. And I just want to say, let's keep that up.
Thank you.
Yes. Margot, I'm glad you asked this question because I was unaware that there was a call for a universal school food program for Canada. And yet I went back to look at your organization and realized you've been lobbying government since about 2010. So something's not working. I think you need more green voices in Parliament that will guarantee to you we will fight for this. And my promise is this is not in our platform. We do have elements of our platform for food security, for replacing imported food with local foods. We have an effort to support humane and sustainable food systems, promote more plant-based eating and reduce consumption of animal source foods. We have all of that there. But I would be more than willing, if elected as your MP, to be a champion, to see this kind of program in our schools. I have seen it at work in schools in Europe and in Asia. It makes a difference. I've also been down to see Jessie Jollymore at Hope Blooms. I know what food can do to bring a community together. And I would love to see this in our schools. So it isn't in our platform, so I can't promise it to you as a Green, but as a Green, I'm independent. And I am allowed to bring things to the table. And you can consider me an ally. So thank you for this question. I truly believe in your program, and I hope you are successful.
Thank you. Lisa.
Thank you. With members of the NDP caucus provincially, I met with the folks at Nourish Nova Scotia. And in fact, the last two provincial NDP platforms have included a school food program, recognizing the important ties to community, to health, to food security, to economic development that can be achieved through such a program. In the federal platform, we commit to partnering with provinces, territories, municipalities, and Indigenous communities to work toward a national school nutrition program that will give every child in Canada access to healthy food and food literacy skills, and will aim to make culturally appropriate food available to children in every community in Canada. The NDP platform also mentions the importance and support for food hubs, a number of which we have seen developed in Nova Scotia, including I think you could consider Hope Blooms a food hub, as well as developing a national food waste strategy and partnering with farmers and communities to support biodiversity and monitor and protect pollinators. Thank you.
Thanks. So that brings us to the end of our first round of questions.
Oh, that's next.
So, well, I'm getting,
You're ahead.
well,
You're
I'm
ahead
still
of
right. I
yourself.
haven't answered on
This is-
UNDRIP.
This is your spreadsheet. So I think in some television game at some point, this is called the short snapper round. I can't remember. So the next few questions are yes or no questions. That's always my favorite thing to ask a politician. I'll ask each of you to respond with either a yes or a no, but then you do get to follow with a brief explanation if need be, and you have 30 seconds in total for each of these questions. Let's start with, we have our wonderful timekeepers right here. Keep an eye on your timekeepers and the yellow cards and the red cards. So the order for this one will be Joanne, and then Lisa and Andy. And this one is about Indigenous rights and protecting Indigenous rights, including the right to free, prior and informed consent, and honoring the treaties of peace and friendship must be central to all of our efforts if we want to create a truly just and sustainable future. Will you implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And if so, how soon?
Yes. The Green Party will reaffirm its support for the implementation of the recommendations of the TRC. And we are committed to implementing UNDRIP for those First Nations who support it. The Green Party believes that every nation has a right to decide who will speak on their behalf, and the Government of Canada must be led by Indigenous people with respect to designing an UNDRIP legislation. We've heard from several First Nations who told us they had not been consulted on Bill C-15, so we will be led by them.
Cute. Lisa.
Yes, New Democrats will immediately put the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is now law, into action in our collective fight against the climate crisis. And this means, again, making First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples full and equal partners in Canada's efforts to build a low carbon future, including by encouraging energy sustainability in remote communities, and ensuring equity opportunities for renewable energy projects as well. My time is up. Okay. 30 seconds. It's going to take a moment. It's going to take a moment to adjust.
Okay. Thank you, Andy.
Yes, and I was proud to vote in favor of UNDRIP legislation, making it law this last session in the House of Commons, which we finally passed after some extremely shameless delay tactics by the Conservatives. We're also committed to implementing all recommendations of the TRC. In fact, so far, 80% of the TRC recommendations that fall in federal jurisdiction are either already completed or well underway. Our government remains committed to achieving all the calls to action under federal or shared jurisdictions. And budget 2021 contained a massive $18 billion, the largest Indigenous investment in Canadian history, to get them all done.
Okay, good. Next.
15 billion.
Oh dear, I may have to subtract that from your next answer. The order for the next question is going to be Lisa, Andy, and Joanne. So get on your marks. Canada's current traceability regulations are insufficient to safeguard our oceans, seafood industry, and Canadian consumers. Will you strengthen seafood traceability regulations for all seafood sold in Canada to track at least the geographic origin, scientific name, and method of production from harvest to plate?
Yes, we want Canadians and their families to have confidence in what they're putting on their plate. We know that illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing hurts conservation efforts, but also the livelihoods of fishers and harvesters. As part of our national food policy, we would work with fishers and harvesters on new food labeling and boat to plate traceability. This is something that the Liberals promised that they would do in 2019, but only committed to it weeks before calling this snap election.
Wonderful.
Yes, and the work is already underway. Re-elected Liberal government will help to boost Canadian fish and seafood products with new rules for tracing and labeling. Due to illegal fishing and complex international supply chains, it's estimated that more than 40% of fish and seafood products sold in Canadian stores is mislabeled. So to combat this fraud and to help Canadian harvesters better market their high-quality products, we're going to move forward with a boat-to-plate traceability program developed in partnership with harvesters and environmental leaders.
Thanks. Joanne, you're up.
Yes, knowledge puts power in the hands of the consumer, and we know consumers want this information. We know what warning labels did for cigarettes and nutrition labels did for dry goods. I try to avoid buying salmon that has come from open net pens. I'm constantly amazed when I ask, where did the salmon come from? Either they don't know, and when they do find out, it was from Chile. I want to know that before I put it in my grocery basket. Thanks very much.
Okay, the next question, Andy, you're in the hot seat first, I think appropriately, and followed by Joanne and then Lisa. In 2019, the federal government committed to transitioning open net pen salmon farming out of the water in BC due to social and environmental concerns. Were made for Atlantic Canada, leaving many coastal communities extremely frustrated. Will you commit to transitioning open net pen salmon farms out of Atlantic Canadian waters by 2025?
I personally will, yes, but unlike BC, where the federal government is the regulator for aquaculture, here in Atlantic Canada, the regulator is the provinces. So let's get on the phone to our newly elected government on this. Having said that, our record in BC clearly shows where we stand on this issue. As a federal government, we'll respect provincial jurisdiction, but as I said, my own perspective is yes, it needs to be phased out on this coast too, and very quickly.
Thank you. Joanne.
Okay. Yes, but I was in BC when I saw what happened to get to that phase out for 2025. And I can tell you, no politician should take credit. It was the people on the ground standing up saying, we won't do this. They even had to do their own science. DFO fought them every step of the way. So my message is, yes, I'll see you at the protest. We've got to get this done. It should happen here, just like it's happening on the West Coast. It just might take us a little bit longer.
Thank you. Lisa.
I was the provincial fisheries and aquaculture critic for much of the last 4 years. And so I know from speaking with many community members and people with organizations how much frustration there is that Nova Scotia is not being treated the same as British Columbia. It is an area that is regulated by the province, but certainly I would work with communities to make sure that we have a voice, that community has a voice in the role of and the future of open net pen salmon aquaculture, finfish aquaculture.
Thank you. You're forgiven for that. So then the final three questions are about the climate crisis. And I don't think anybody here needs to be reminded that the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, was alarming and blunt, another understatement. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres referred to it as a code red for humanity that must sound a death bell for coal and fossil fuels. So question 12, and the order of this one is going to be Joanne, Andy, and Lisa. I believe it is, yes. Will you commit to require all sectors to reduce carbon emissions by 60% from 2005 levels by 2030 and make it law?
Yes. Yes to reducing our carbon emissions by 60% from 2005 levels. And if you check the platforms, we are the only party that is matching the science, the only party that will do so. We believe the target should be binding, and there should be a commitment that we make to other countries that we have been working with through the COP process from 1 to 25. Let's make it binding at COP 26.
Andy.
The Liberal platform is 40% below 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050, which is where the science says we need to go. And we have legislated our net zero target into law, but I want Haligonians to know that I will always work to go further and faster. Now, there is one analyst who advises the NDP government in British Columbia who has given the federal NDP plan a 2 out of 10 score compared to an 8 out of 10 for the Liberal plan. So again, debates are about contrasting platforms, so I need to bring that up with respect. As for a Conservative government, well, the impact on climate change would be catastrophic.
The NDP platform commitment is to reduce emissions by at least 50% from 2005 levels by 2030, reaching further whenever possible to account for Canada's fair share. We would also create and fund a climate accountability office to provide independent oversight of federal climate progress, to engage with the public, and to make recommendations on how to actually not miss another target.
Okay, the order for the next question, question 13, is going to be Lisa, Andy, and Joanne. And it's short and tough. Are you prepared to spend what it takes to contribute to the global effort to avoid the worst of the climate crisis?
We must take a global leadership role in helping low-income countries deal with the impacts of climate change. And again, I go back to my point earlier that addressing inequality is the path to addressing climate change, because it is the wreaking of havoc.
Prayers have begun, yeah. We're in a mosque and the call to prayer has begun. So if you hear that behind you, so be it.
I think I had already run out of time, but I will say, we also commit to creating a climate bank to facilitate climate financing to help protect people who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as well as living up to new emissions reductions targets here at home. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. There's a little bit of leeway, given that there is something happening behind that may slow you down a bit. So the very last, oh, I'm sorry. No, you didn't. I'm very sorry. Yes, sorry.
Andy next and then me? Yeah, I think it's Andy.
For the next question, yes. Oh, I'm very sorry. I'm also the one who's distracted. So yes, please, that's Andy and Joanne.
Okay. All right. So yes, we're prepared to spend what it takes. And I think our record shows that. The ICIP Green Fund, transit funding, DMAF, clean and renewable energy research, phasing out coal, plastics ban, habitat conservation, 5,000 grants for EVs and home energy retrofits. On and on it goes. There are literally hundreds of these programs that we've created. We also see a massive economic opportunity in the transition to a green economy, because fighting climate change is good for the economy and can keep people employed, especially in a just transition.
Yes, and here's why. Much like the pandemic, where all parties agreed that we should do what we needed to stop the virus from spreading and to find a vaccine quickly. If we take the same approach to this climate emergency, then we will have a future. If we don't, then we won't be worried about GDP profits or finding ways to stay alive. There was a t-shirt that summed this up for me, and I really liked it. It says, "You can't breathe money."
I just want to check to see if anybody on Zoom or out there is having problems hearing us, just so we're okay. Okay. So we'll move along, and this really is the last question. And the order for this one will be Andy, Joanne, and Lisa. And again, it's a yes or no with a short explanation. Will you end all government subsidies for fossil fuels and ban new fossil fuel projects?
Yes, we will end all government subsidies for fossil fuels. I do do not support any new fossil fuel projects. The Liberal platform commits to ending subsidies by 2023, 2 years earlier than previously planned, and calls for a just transition. Now, the environmental defense claim that we spent $18 billion on fossil fuel subsidies, 15 billion of that was for worker wage compensation so that families could feed themselves and pay their mortgages. That was made available to every single Canadian. So we need to keep that in perspective. Thank you very much.
Well, Andy, I'm glad you said yes, but I think we could be forgiven if we think that you say yes, but you're not sure when, because in 2015, the Liberal Party said, yes, they would end subsidies to fossil fuels and they bought a pipeline. So yes, it makes sense. And I hope you keep this because investing in fossil fuels is investing in dinosaurs. And we need to take that money now, say to big business that's in fossil fuels, we're moving to the future. We are going to invest this where it really will make a difference. And that's new sources of energy.
Thank you.
The NDP will fulfill Canada's G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and redirect those funds to low carbon initiatives, and make sure that future governments can't reverse this by putting in place legislation to ban any future oil, gas, and pipeline subsidies. We would be in a better position now facing this crisis had government not, in so many instances over so many years, propped up this industry, which simply is putting our future on the planet at stake.
Thank you, everyone. So this brings us now to the closing statements, and my spreadsheet is a little bit confusing here. So I'm making an executive decision that the order for the opening statements will be Andy, Lisa, and Joanne, if that's okay. Nobody's going to stage a coup. Good. I'd like to invite each of you to speak for 2 minutes, and on whatever you want, but your 2 minutes will be monitored by the timekeepers. So, Andy.
Thank you. Former NDP leader Tom Mulcair called it absolutely marvelous. Former BC Green Party leader Andrew Weaver called it the only credible plan put forward by any party at the federal level. My predecessor and former NDP deputy leader Megan Leslie said it has Canada showing real leadership. The president of the Ocean Networks Canada, Dr. Kate Moran, said it places Canada among the most ambitious countries on clean energy. Mark Jacquard, professor of sustainable energy at Simon Fraser and advisor to the BC NDP Premier John Horgan, called it effective and affordable and gave it the highest score of the parties. They're all talking about the Liberal climate plan. I want climate voters to know that when they vote Liberal, they are voting for the best climate plan on offer. I want climate voters to know that in this election, you don't have to vote out of fear or vote against anything. You can vote for a credible plan, an ambitious plan. You can vote for a strong record with me locally and our government nationally. And yes, you can vote for the only party that stands a chance to stop the Conservative government that would take us backward. That party is the Liberal Party. I'm running for re-election on strong, demonstrable record of climate action, beginning decades ago in my profession as a city planner, and continuing as the MP for Halifax, where I've been very busy putting a climate lens on federal infrastructure, denying funding for diesel buses and electrifying the Halifax transit fleet, cleaning up Harrietsfield, supporting our coastal communities, including helping get that breakwater in Harrietsfield rebuilt, leading the National Active Transportation Strategy, creating the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative, and much, much more. This is my record. This is the leadership I've shown and will continue to show as your member of Parliament. I'm asking for your vote on September 20th to continue being a champion for Halifax. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you. My journey into elected life very much grew out of my own need to engage in things like helping to build community gardens and hosting community suppers, which was in and of itself a response to some pretty significant climate anxiety as a mom of young kids. We can hope for better. I do truly believe that the path for a better future involves taking care of each other, a real commitment to our collective well-being, with the collective being as expansive as everybody on the planet. And I think that a parliamentarian a member of the NDP caucus, in all likelihood, holding the balance of power in another minority parliament, can have power and can wield influence and can help us build a better future that our children can look forward to. Andy, if we're not voting out of fear, then maybe you could stop campaigning against the straw man of a Conservative MP who didn't even show up at this debate, because in Halifax, that is not a likely outcome. And also, unfortunately, maybe for the folks who chose to have an election in early September, a majority Liberal government is also not a likely outcome. So I would be honored to go back, into elected office and to try to fill the shoes that were once filled by Alexa McDonough and by Megan Leslie, and be a strong representative for Halifax and bring a Nova Scotia perspective to the NDP caucus in Ottawa. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you. And I do want to thank the Ecology Action Centre. I want to thank them for being in Halifax, because I think for a long time, this centre has been the green voice when there wasn't a viable, credible candidate to be your green voice in Ottawa. And I've got to thank you for the work you've done and continue to do. And I will support you in the future, no matter what happens. So I want to thank you, Joan, for being here and keeping us on, and for the mosque and the staff for being here because democracy demands what we're doing here. And I am very afraid of what's happening. Lisa says, yes, Andy's pointing to the fear of the straw man. We're not going to elect a Conservative in this riding. But I have had so many people, and unfortunately, they're usually NDP people, say, why are you running, Joanne? Because you're a reason that Andy might win. And I go, oh, come on. This is a democracy. You have 3 remarkable candidates. I respect both of these people a great deal. And democracy is about having good choices. If you want good people to run, then you need to stop telling them that they shouldn't run. I am running as a Green because I do believe this is the top priority in this election, the environment. And if we are going to tell the politicians, we're not going to form government, but I can tell you Green MPs in the House of Commons make sure that every day that that House is sitting, this matter is being discussed. And we have credibility. We haven't changed our position on this over the last 3 election cycles. I'm running as a Green because the Green Party remains the only party that has a target and a plan that corresponds to the science and gets us where we need to be. I echo Maggie. I have a fierce hopefulness. This is our moment. If you want Green, vote Green.
Thank you all for very powerful closing statements and for all the answers that you gave tonight. That actually concludes the debate for this evening. Thanks again to all of you for coming and for participating with all your hearts in the debate. To the Ummah Mosque and the Community Center for hosting us, also thank you. And to all the Ecology Action Centre staffers and volunteers who've made this evening possible. And of course, to all of you for joining us wherever you are. If you'd like more resources about important environmental issues during this federal election, including a guide about what to ask your candidates at the door, you can check out the EAC's website at https, I can't do all those things, ecologyaction.ca/2021-federal-election. And they're going to put that link up on the chat now because I'm sure you didn't get it very clearly from me. Or you can visit, and you should also visit https://www.elections.ca to find out the location of your polling place along with other information about the election. Nothing could be more important than everybody votes on election day, September 20th or before. Thanks to everybody.